Man is not poor because he lacks wealth. He is poor because he does not own his own life. Karl Marx was not merely an economist, nor simply a revolutionary. He was a thinker who tore open the structure of modern society and asked the question few dared to confront. Why does the human being labor endlessly, yet remain estranged from himself? Before sociology became an academic discipline, before capitalism crowned itself as destiny, Marx had already exposed its inner fracture. When the 19th century celebrated industry as progress, he saw the silent cost paid by the worker's soul. His philosophy was not built for complaint. It was built for liberation. She did not criticize society to indulge in resentment. She revealed the invisible mechanisms that normalize domination. Behind wages, contracts, markets, and schools, she detected something deeper. A system that transforms living time into profit and calls this freedom. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Now we must confront the uncomfortable truth. Even in 2025, surrounded by technology and convenience, many still feel replaceable, measurable, exhausted. Modern systems promise autonomy, yet quietly shape our desires, our ambitions, even our sense of worth. We consume more, but create less of ourselves. This is where our exploration begins, not with slogans, not with ideology, but with alienation, the fracture between human potential and social structure. From here, we enter the first meditation. The human being estranged from his own labor and from himself. Alienation is not an economic accident. It is the quiet fracture of the human soul. Marx does not begin with money. He begins with the worker, with the one who labors, produces, builds, and yet feels strangely absent from his own life. Before sociology formalized inequality, before modern management perfected efficiency, Marx saw the deeper wound. Human beings working not as self-expression, but as survival mechanism. In his early manuscripts on alienation, he did not speak merely of wages or contracts. He diagnosed a condition. Labor, which should be the unfolding of human creativity, had become external to the worker. Instead of recognizing himself in what he produces, the worker feels drained by it. Work becomes compulsion, not because effort itself is unnatural, but because its purpose is no longer self-realization. It is subsistence. First, labor becomes forced rather than expressive. Human beings are unique in their capacity to shape the world consciously, to imagine, design, and then materialize an idea. In healthy conditions, this process affirms identity. You see yourself in your creation. You recognize your intention made visible. Under capitalism, Marx argues, labor is detached from this affirmation. The worker does not control the conditions of production. He does not determine the purpose. He sells his capacity to work in exchange for survival. The misunderstanding is to think that any paid job equals exploitation. Marx's point is sharper. The issue is not payment alone. It is the separation between the worker and the meaning of his work. When activity becomes mere means to live rather than expression of life, alienation begins. Second, the worker becomes estranged from the product of his own labor. What he creates does not belong to him. It stands opposed to him. The object he produced enters the market as commodity, owned by another. The more he produces, the more powerful the world of objects becomes, and the poorer he feels in spirit. This inversion is profound. Creation should enrich the creator. Yet here, creation strengthens an external system that dominates him. The misunderstanding is to see this as envy over ownership. Marx is exposing something deeper. When your work no longer reflects your will, you lose part of yourself. The product becomes alien, even hostile. Third, alienation extends beyond objects to human relationships. When labor is mediated by market exchange, people relate to each other through contracts, wages, competition. Cooperation is structured by necessity, not solidarity. Each worker becomes competitor to another. Instead of recognizing shared humanity, individuals measure one another by productivity and efficiency. The system encourages rivalry rather than connection. The misunderstanding is to believe this is simply human nature. Marx rejects that claim. He sees this fragmentation as structural outcome of economic organization. Fourth, alienation reaches inward. The worker becomes estranged from himself. Work consumes energy without nourishing identity. He feels most himself outside work and least himself during it. Life divides into survival and fleeting escape. This split produces psychological exhaustion. Alienation is not only economic deprivation, it is existential dislocation. The human essence, the capacity for conscious, creative activity is suppressed. In a world approaching 2025, this diagnosis resonates with disturbing clarity. Productivity has intensified. Technology accelerates output. Work follows individuals into private spaces through digital devices. The line between labor and rest dissolves. Many experience chronic fatigue, not solely from physical exertion, but from meaninglessness. They perform tasks disconnected from personal values. They optimize performance metrics while feeling hollow. The crisis is subtle. Salaries may rise, living standards may improve, yet alienation persists. Because the problem is not consumption alone, it is ownership of one's activity. Do you shape your work, or does it shape you? Do you see yourself in what you produce, or do you feel replaceable? Psychologically, alienation breeds anxiety and resentment. When individuals cannot locate meaning in their labor, they seek compensation elsewhere, through consumption, through status, through distraction. Yet these substitutes rarely satisfy. The deeper hunger is for authorship, to act as subject rather than instrument. Marx's insight challenges a comfortable assumption of modern society, that freedom consists primarily in choice within the market. Choose career, choose brand, choose lifestyle. But if the structure of labor itself remains external and compulsory, choice becomes superficial. Alienation persists beneath surface variety. The existential dimension intensifies here. Human beings require recognition, not applause, recognition of their capacity to shape reality meaningfully. When work reduces them to interchangeable units, self-respect erodes. They internalize a diminished sense of worth. Productivity replaces dignity. Marx's critique does not romanticize pre-industrial hardship. He does not idealize manual labor for its own sake. He asks whether the organization of production allows individuals to develop fully. Does it enable creativity? Does it foster solidarity? Or does it fragment life into isolated economic transactions? In approaching 2025, automation and artificial intelligence complicate the landscape further. As machines perform increasing tasks, the question sharpens. What remains of human labor? If productivity becomes detached even further from human intention, alienation risks deepening. Without conscious restructuring, technological progress may intensify estrangement rather than reduce it. Alienation also distorts perception of value. Workers may measure themselves solely by income or status. They begin to equate worth with market demand. This internalization is profound. The system no longer needs external coercion alone. Individuals police themselves. They compete, they compare, they blame themselves for structural constraints. Marx forces confrontation with uncomfortable truth. When the means of production are controlled by few, and the majority must sell labor to survive, inequality is not anomaly. It is built into structure. But beyond inequality lies something more corrosive, a spiritual fracture, the reduction of life to economic function. The remedy in Marx's vision is not charity or minor reform. It is transformation of ownership and control. When workers collectively govern production, labor can become cooperative rather than competitive, creative rather than forced. The point is not to eliminate effort, but to align it with shared purpose. Critics argue that alienation is inevitable in complex societies, that specialization requires fragmentation. Marx challenges this fatalism. Complexity does not necessitate dehumanization. Organization can either empower or diminish. The decisive factor is who controls it, and for what end. The internal question emerges. Do you experience your work as extension of your humanity or as external burden? Do you see in your daily activity the reflection of your values, or do you count hours until escape? These are not trivial concerns. They determine psychological health. Alienation does not scream. It numbs. It normalizes dissatisfaction. It convinces individuals that emptiness is personal failure rather than structural design. Marx's analysis tears away this normalization. He exposes alienation as condition, not character flaw. And yet, alienation does not operate in isolation. It is reinforced by a system that transforms everything into commodity. Not only objects, but relationships. Not only goods, but time itself. The product becomes more visible than the human relation behind it. To understand alienation fully, one must examine how commodities conceal the social connections that created them, how value appears in price, while human labor disappears from sight, and how this concealment deepens the estrangement Marx first revealed. The commodity is not an object. it is a veil. What appears in the marketplace as a simple thing with a price tag conceals an entire network of human relations beneath it. Marx moves from alienation within labor to the strange theater of exchange, where products seem alive and people seem invisible. This is not exaggeration, it is diagnosis. In capitalism, everything tends toward becoming a commodity. Not only bread and steel, but education, health, attention, even identity. A commodity is something produced not for direct use by its maker, but for exchange. At first glance, this appears neutral. People trade what they have for what they need. Yet Marx insists that something more subtle occurs. The social relations between human beings take the form of relations between things. First, the commodity transforms human labor into abstract value. When a product enters the market, its origin fades. The countless hours, the fatigue, the coordination of workers are compressed into a price. The object stands on the shelf as if it emerged spontaneously. Its value appears intrinsic, as though residing within the thing itself. The misunderstanding is to believe that price reflects simple supply and demand alone. Marx argues that beneath market fluctuations lies socially necessary labor time. But the market does not show this labor transparently. It disguises it. Second, commodity fetishism emerges. Marx uses this term deliberately. In religious fetishism, objects are believed to possess independent power. In capitalist society, commodities seem to acquire life of their own. They rise and fall in price. They dominate headlines. They shape decisions of governments. Meanwhile, the workers who produce them disappear from sight. Human relationships become mediated by objects. We no longer encounter one another directly as collaborators in production, but indirectly as buyers and sellers. The misunderstanding is to think fetishism is superstition of the uneducated. It is structural. Even the most informed participant navigates a system where social power appears attached to things rather than people. Third, labor itself becomes measurable unit, detached from lived experience. Time is converted into wages. Effort is calculated into cost. A person's creative capacity is reduced to hourly rate. This abstraction is efficient. It enables complex coordination, yet it also dehumanizes. When labor becomes number, individuality recedes. The worker begins to view himself through the same lens. How much am I worth per hour? What is my market value? Self-perception internalizes commodification. In a world approaching 2025, this logic expands. Data becomes commodity. Attention becomes commodity. Personal information circulates as asset. Individuals curate themselves as brands. Social media profiles function as marketplaces of visibility. The commodity form penetrates not only factories, but consciousness. Identity becomes something to package and exchange. The psychological consequence deepens alienation. When you relate to others primarily through exchange, trust shifts. Interactions acquire transactional undertones. Networking replaces friendship. Collaboration is evaluated for return on investment. This does not eliminate genuine connection, but it pressures it. The structure rewards calculation. Marx's insight pierces deeper. Commodity exchange obscures exploitation because it presents equality at the surface. Buyer and seller appear free and equal. The worker voluntarily sells labor power. The capitalist voluntarily pays wages. Contracts are signed. The market seems neutral. Yet beneath this formal equality lies asymmetry. The worker must sell labor to survive. The capitalist owns the means of production. Freedom here is constrained by necessity. The misunderstanding is to confuse legal equality with material equality. The fetishism of commodities also distorts perception of wealth. Wealth appears as accumulation of objects and money. The human relations that generate them recede. People admire luxury goods without considering the labor chain behind them. They celebrate corporate success without asking whose time and energy were compressed into profit. The system encourages focus on surface. This concealment stabilizes the structure. If social relations were visible in their full complexity, conflict might intensify. By masking them behind prices and contracts, the system naturalizes inequality. It appears as outcome of market forces rather than arrangement of power. The existential dimension is subtle but profound. When everything becomes commodity, meaning risks commodification as well. Experiences are consumed rather than lived. Travel becomes content. Learning becomes credential. Even activism can become brand. The human being drifts toward becoming consumer first, creator second. Marx does not condemn exchange as such. Trade existed long before capitalism. His critique targets the dominance of the commodity form. When exchange value overshadows use value, when the primary question becomes not what something is for, but what it can fetch, priorities shift. Production aims at profit rather than need. This inversion shapes society. In approaching 2025, global supply chains stretch across continents. A device assembled in one country contains components from many others. Consumers hold in their hands condensed labor of thousands they will never meet. The scale magnifies fetishism. The more complex the chain, the easier it is to forget the human links. Commodity fetishism also reshapes desire. Advertising does not merely inform, it constructs aspiration. It attaches identity to objects. You are what you buy. Ownership becomes substitute for self-realization. This intensifies alienation because consumption promises wholeness but delivers only temporary stimulation. The worker, now also consumer, experiences double bind. He sells labor to earn wages, then uses wages to purchase commodities that sustain the system that alienates him. This cycle appears voluntary. It feels normal. That is its strength. The structure does not rely solely on overt coercion. It operates through habit and desire. Marx's critique is not moral outrage at individuals buying and selling. It is structural analysis of how commodity exchange organizes social life. When relations between people appear as relations between things, consciousness adjusts. People begin to think in terms of assets, costs, efficiency. These categories seep into areas once guided by different values. Education becomes investment. Health becomes industry. Art becomes product line. The vocabulary of the market colonizes domains of life. The line between human need and market opportunity blurs. The deeper question emerges. If commodities conceal human relations, how do we recover sight? How do we recognize that behind every price stands labor? Behind every profit stands unpaid surplus. Behind every polished object stands fatigue and coordination. To answer that, Marx moves further into analysis of value itself. If commodities dominate perception, one must ask what determines their value. If price obscures labor, what is the relation between labor and value? And if profit emerges within seemingly equal exchange, where precisely does surplus arise? Only by dissecting the logic of value can the concealment of exploitation be fully revealed, and the system that transforms human activity into commodity be understood at its core. Value is not born in the marketplace. It is born in labor. Price fluctuates. Markets shift. Supply and demand rise and fall like surface waves. But beneath this movement, Marx identifies a deeper structure. Commodities exchange according to a hidden measure, and that measure is human labor time. After exposing how commodities conceal social relations, Marx descends further. If objects dominate perception and appear to carry value within themselves, we must ask what that value truly represents. In his labor theory of value, he advances a claim that unsettles the foundation of capitalist self-understanding. The value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce it. First, socially necessary labor time is not individual effort. It is not the number of hours one particular worker spends crafting an item inefficiently. It is the average time required under normal conditions, with average skill and technology. This abstraction matters. Value does not reward laziness or incompetence. It reflects collective standard. The misunderstanding is to reduce this to simplistic equation of hours equal price. Marx's argument is structural. Across the system, commodities exchange in proportions that reflect the labor embodied in them. Second, money functions as condensed labor. When commodities circulate, their value must be expressed in universal equivalent. Money becomes that equivalent. It appears as independent power, yet it is representation of accumulated labor. A bank account, a stock valuation, a corporate asset, all ultimately trace back to human work. Yet fetishism obscures this origin. Money seems to generate money. Capital appears self-expanding. Marx tears away this illusion. Capital expands because labor produces more value than it receives in wages. Third, profit arises from surplus value. This is the most controversial element. In a free market exchange, the worker sells labor power at its value. The capitalist pays wages sufficient to reproduce the worker's capacity to work. On the surface, the exchange is equal. Yet during the working day, the laborer produces value greater than the value of wages paid. Part of the day covers necessary labor, producing equivalent of wage. The remaining hours generate surplus. This surplus becomes profit. Exploitation does not require overt theft. It is built into structure. The misunderstanding here is common. Some argue that profit rewards risk, innovation, coordination. Marx does not deny organizational function. He questions why ownership of means of production entitles one to surplus created by others. The key lies in control. The worker does not own the product. The capitalist does. Therefore, the surplus belongs to the owner, not the producer. In a world approaching 2025, this mechanism has not disappeared. It has evolved. Gig economy workers provide services through platforms that extract percentage from each transaction. Digital labor generates data monetized by corporations. Employees create intellectual property owned by firms. The form changes, the logic persists. Surplus flows upward. Psychologically, the abstraction of value intensifies alienation. Workers may not see the surplus they generate. They receive wage, perhaps competitive by market standards, yet the difference between what they produce and what they are paid remains hidden. Because exploitation is structural, it feels natural. It is legalized, contractual, normal. Marx insists that even in a so-called free market, exploitation operates. Freedom to sell labor does not negate necessity to sell it. When survival depends on wage, choice is constrained. The system does not require chains. It requires property relations. The labor theory of value also reveals instability within capitalism. Competition drives capitalists to increase productivity. New technology reduces necessary labor time per commodity. As productivity rises, individual firms seek advantage. Yet across the system, reduction in labor time reduces value per unit. This dynamic pressures profit rates. It drives expansion into new markets. It fuels crisis cycles. The individual worker experiences this as pressure. Efficiency demands intensify. Tasks accelerate. Surveillance increases. Performance metrics proliferate. Underneath lies pursuit of surplus. The system must extract more value in less time. Human rhythm collides with economic imperative. The existential consequence deepens. When time becomes measure of value, life fragments into quantifiable units. Minutes become billable. Hours become productive or wasted. Leisure becomes preparation for work. Even rest is instrumentalized. The human being internalizes stopwatch. Marx's analysis challenges moral narratives that attribute poverty solely to laziness or wealth solely to merit. If value arises from collective labor and surplus flows to those controlling production, inequality is not purely reflection of talent. It is structural distribution of ownership. Critics argue that modern economies are too complex for labor theory to apply, that knowledge, innovation, entrepreneurship create value beyond simple labor time. Yet even knowledge requires labor, research hours, design efforts, coding sessions. The abstraction remains. Human activity underpins production. In approaching 2025, automation complicates analysis. Machines reduce direct labor in many sectors. Some interpret this as weakening Marx's thesis. Yet machines themselves are products of labor. They transfer value gradually as they depreciate. Moreover, the design, maintenance, and integration of technology remain human processes. The question shifts, but does not vanish. The deeper tension surfaces. If surplus extraction drives accumulation, and accumulation concentrates ownership, class divisions intensify, wealth centralizes, political influence follows. The market appears neutral, yet outcomes cluster around those controlling capital. Marx does not romanticize poverty. He does not idealize suffering worker. He reveals mechanism. Value creation and value appropriation diverge. This divergence generates conflict, not necessarily immediate revolt, but persistent tension. The individual worker may feel frustration without clear articulation. Why does effort not translate into security proportionate to contribution? Why does productivity increase, not guarantee leisure? Why does growth not distribute evenly? The labor theory of value offers structural answer rather than moral accusation. This theory also reframes freedom. If economic life determines access to resources, and economic structure channels surplus upward, political freedom alone may prove insufficient. Formal rights coexist with material constraint. The worker may vote, speak, consume, yet remain bound by necessity to sell labor under conditions not of his choosing. Marx's analysis does not end with value. It expands into class. If ownership determines appropriation of surplus, society divides into those who own means of production and those who sell labor. Interests diverge structurally. The conflict is not accidental. It is embedded in economic relations. And so, the inquiry moves from abstraction of value to concrete alignment of power. If surplus defines profit and ownership defines control, then society organizes itself around opposing positions. One class depends on maximizing surplus. Another depends on maximizing wage and security. The tension between them does not arise from misunderstanding. It arises from structure. To understand the motion of history itself, one must examine how these classes confront, negotiate, and collide across time. History does not move by harmony. It moves by conflict. Marx does not see society as a neutral field of cooperation. He sees it as structured tension between classes defined by their relation to the means of production. After uncovering how value is created and how surplus is extracted, the next step is inevitable. Who benefits? Who controls? Who decides? Class for Marx is not a matter of income bracket or lifestyle. It is structural position. One class owns the means of production, factories, land, capital, infrastructure. The other class owns only its labor power. This division is not cosmetic. It shapes interests at their root. The capitalist seeks to maximize surplus. The worker seeks to secure wages, stability, dignity. Their goals intersect only partially. Beneath negotiation lies opposition. First, class struggle arises from objective conditions, not personal hatred. The capitalist may be benevolent, the worker may be loyal, yet the logic of the system presses both into roles. Competition forces capitalists to reduce costs, increase productivity, extract more value. Workers resist intensification, seek higher wages, demand safety. These tensions are not accidents. They are embedded in structure. The misunderstanding is to reduce conflict to moral failure of individuals. Marx insists it is systemic. Second, class struggle extends beyond wages. It is struggle over control. Who decides what is produced, how it is produced, For whom? Under capitalism, these decisions rest primarily with those who own capital. Workers execute, but do not govern. Even democratic political systems often leave economic decisions insulated from collective control. Thus, conflict appears not only in strikes or protests, but in everyday negotiation over time, autonomy, and conditions. Third, history itself, Marx argues, unfolds through class struggle. From ancient slave societies to feudalism to capitalism, each mode of production contains internal contradictions. Dominant classes consolidate power, subordinate classes resist. Over time, tension accumulates, structural shifts occur. This is not mechanical determinism. It is recognition that material organization of society shapes its trajectory. In a world approaching 2025, class divisions mutate but persist. Global corporations operate across borders. Financial capital flows instantly. Meanwhile, precarious labor expands. Temporary contracts, gig platforms, informal work. The language of entrepreneurship masks dependence. Individuals are encouraged to see themselves as independent actors while remaining embedded in structures they do not control. The psychological dimension of class is subtle. Workers may internalize aspirations of capital. They may identify with brands rather than with fellow laborers. Ideology fragments solidarity. Nationalism can divide workers across borders, even when their economic positions align. Marx foresaw this fragmentation. Without collective awareness, structural power remains unchallenged. Class struggle is not always visible as open conflict. It can be institutional. Labor laws, tax policies, trade agreements, education funding. These shape distribution of surplus and opportunity. When policies favor capital accumulation over social welfare, class dynamics operate quietly. The existential impact surfaces in daily life. Long working hours, job insecurity, debt, competition among peers. These are not random stresses. They reflect balance of power. When labor is abundant and capital concentrated, bargaining weakens. Anxiety becomes common condition. Marx does not romanticize revolution as spectacle. He analyzes conditions under which class consciousness emerges. When workers recognize shared position, when they perceive exploitation not as personal failure, but structural reality, solidarity becomes possible. Yet consciousness is not automatic. It competes with ideology, with distraction, with hope of individual escape. In approaching 2025, technology amplifies both awareness and division. Information spreads rapidly, yet misinformation spreads as well. Workers can witness global inequality instantly, yet also become absorbed in individual narratives of success. The myth of upward mobility tempers anger. The possibility that one might join the owning class dampens collective action. Class struggle also manifests internationally. Capital seeks lower labor costs globally. Production shifts to regions with cheaper workforce. This mobility pressures workers in higher wage areas. It pits them against one another. Marx anticipated expansion of capital beyond national borders. He saw imperialism as extension of search for surplus. The conflict is not limited to factory floor. It shapes culture. Media owned by concentrated capital influences narrative. Public discourse often frames labor demands as threats to economic stability. The language of efficiency dominates. Structural inequality is rebranded as competitive necessity. Yet tension persists. When crises erupt, financial collapses, pandemics, supply chain disruptions, underlying contradictions surface. Essential workers are praised, yet underpaid. Profits may rise, even as unemployment spreads. These contradictions sharpen perception. Marx's analysis invites uncomfortable questions. Can interests of capital and labor ever fully align within capitalist framework? Reforms may soften edges, regulations may protect rights, but as long as surplus extraction defines accumulation, tension remains. Critics argue that class is an outdated concept in diversified economies, that middle classes blur boundaries, yet ownership remains decisive. Those who derive income primarily from capital differ fundamentally from those who rely on wages. Even professionals with high salaries remain dependent on employment contracts. The psychological barrier to recognizing class struggle lies in individualism. Modern culture celebrates personal responsibility. Success is attributed to effort, failure to deficiency. Structural analysis disrupts this narrative. It reveals limits imposed by position. Marx's vision does not reduce individuals to class puppets. He acknowledges complexity, but he insists that material conditions shape possibilities. To ignore class is to ignore foundation. As tensions intensify, attention turns to institutions that shape consciousness itself. If class structure reproduces across generations, how does society maintain stability? How do schools, families, and cultural systems transmit acceptance of existing order? How does ideology naturalize inequality so effectively that many defend a system that constrains them? The struggle extends beyond factory and market into mind and education. Understanding this reproduction of class order requires examining how consciousness is formed, disciplined, and directed from early life onward. Education is not neutral. It is rehearsal for obedience. Marx does not treat schools as innocent spaces of enlightenment floating above economic reality. He sees them as institutions embedded within the structure of production, quietly shaping minds to fit the needs of the system. If class struggle defines the material foundation of society, education becomes one of the primary mechanisms through which that structure reproduces itself. After recognizing that class is rooted in ownership of the means of production, a sharper question emerges. How does this division persist across generations? Why do children of workers so often become workers, and children of owners inherit advantage? The answer lies not only in property law, but in consciousness. Education transmits not merely knowledge, but norms, expectations, and limits. First, schools train submission to hierarchy. From early age, students learn to sit still, follow instructions, meet deadlines set by authority. They are evaluated constantly, graded, ranked, compared. Competition becomes normal. Success is measured by performance within predefined criteria. This mirrors workplace logic. The misunderstanding is to believe discipline exists purely for intellectual growth. Discipline also conditions individuals to accept external evaluation as natural. Second, education reproduces class inequality through differential access. Schools in affluent areas received more resources, smaller classes, advanced programs, networks of influence. Meanwhile, underfunded schools struggle with overcrowding and limited materials. The result is predictable. Opportunities diverge early. Meritocracy rhetoric masks structural disparity. The misunderstanding is to attribute outcomes solely to effort. Effort matters, but context shapes its effectiveness. Third, curriculum itself reflects dominant ideology. History may emphasize national triumphs over labor struggles. Economics courses may treat market relations as neutral facts rather than contested structures. Critical perspectives are often marginal. Students internalize worldview in which existing economic order appears inevitable. Education becomes subtle tool of normalization. In a world approaching 2025, digital technology transforms classrooms, but does not automatically liberate them. Online platforms expand access, yet also standardize content. Algorithms tailor learning pathways, but they also collect data and reinforce measurable outputs. Efficiency increases, reflection does not necessarily follow. The psychological consequence is profound. Students learn to equate self-worth with performance metrics, grades, test scores, rankings. These numbers appear objective, yet they often reflect conformity to institutional expectations. Creativity that deviates from rubric may be penalized. Critical thought that challenges underlying assumptions may be discouraged implicitly. Marx's insight does not deny genuine learning. Many teachers strive to inspire curiosity. Many institutions foster growth. The critique targets structural alignment between education and economic order. When schooling prepares individuals primarily to enter a labor market rather than to question its structure, reproduction of class persists. Competition intensifies this reproduction. Students compete for scholarships, placements, internships. Cooperation may be praised rhetorically, but rewarded less tangibly. Individual achievement overshadows collective advancement. This mirrors capitalist emphasis on competition as driver of efficiency. The ideology of equal opportunity reinforces acceptance. If everyone is told that education offers path to success, then failure appears personal. Structural barriers fade from view. The narrative becomes self-responsibility. Work harder, study more, adapt. While some indeed ascend, many remain constrained by conditions beyond individual control. In approaching 2025, rising student debt exemplifies tension. Education is marketed as investment. Individuals borrow heavily to enhance employability. Knowledge becomes commodity purchased at high cost. Graduates enter workforce burdened by debt, limiting freedom. Education, which should expand possibility, can entrench dependence. Marx's critique implies that true emancipatory education cannot exist fully within unchanged economic structure. To cultivate critical consciousness while funneling students into exploitative labor relations generates contradiction. Students may perceive injustice, yet feel powerless to alter it. The deeper existential question surfaces. What is education for? Is it preparation for economic survival or development of human capacities? Under capitalism, the first often dominates. Subjects deemed profitable receive priority funding. Arts and humanities may be marginalized unless they demonstrate market value. Ideology operates not only through curriculum, but through aspiration. Students are encouraged to dream within boundaries of market logic. Become entrepreneur, innovator, high-earning professional. Rarely are they invited to imagine alternative modes of organizing production itself. Yet education also holds potential for rupture. Exposure to critical theory, to history of labor movements, to analysis of inequality can awaken awareness. When students connect personal frustration to structural forces, alienation shifts into critique. Consciousness can become site of resistance. The family reinforces educational reproduction. Parents with resources provide tutoring, networks, cultural capital. Expectations differ across classes. Children internalize these expectations. Confidence, language patterns, familiarity with institutional codes all influence trajectory. Marx would argue that without transformation of property relations, educational reform alone cannot eradicate class reproduction. Structural inequality shapes access and outcome. Yet education remains crucial arena because consciousness shapes action. A worker aware of structural exploitation perceives options differently than one who internalizes blame. In approaching 2025, the narrative of lifelong learning emerges. Individuals must continually reskill to remain competitive. Responsibility for adaptation shifts to worker. Corporations externalize training costs. Flexibility becomes virtue. Stability becomes relic. Education transforms into endless self-optimization cycle. This cycle mirrors alienation. Learning detached from intrinsic curiosity becomes instrumental. Certificates replace comprehension. The joy of discovery recedes behind necessity of employability. Marx's analysis thus extends from factory floor to classroom. Class struggle is not fought only in strikes, but in syllabi, in funding decisions, in narratives about merit and success. Education can either reproduce hierarchy or challenge it. The direction depends on broader economic structure. As consciousness forms, it intersects with another intimate institution that quietly sustains the system, the family. Beyond formal schooling, the family organizes care, socialization, and unpaid labor. It reproduces labor power daily and generationally. To understand how capitalism sustains itself, one must examine not only factories and schools, but households. Within them, invisible labor maintains workers, shapes gender roles, and stabilizes hierarchy in ways often unnoticed, yet structurally essential. The family is not merely a private refuge, it is a silent factory. Marx's analysis does not stop at the workplace or the school. It enters the home. It examines the intimate sphere where labor power is restored, children are socialized, and hierarchy is rehearsed daily without appearing political. What looks like love and tradition often carries structural function. If labor produces value in the market, then something must reproduce labor itself. Workers must eat, rest, recover, and raise the next generation. This work rarely appears in economic calculations. It is unpaid, it is naturalized, it is feminized. Yet without it, the system collapses. First, reproductive labor sustains capitalism invisibly. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, emotional support. These activities restore the worker's capacity to labor the next day. They ensure continuity across generations. Yet because they do not produce commodities for exchange, they are excluded from value calculations. The misunderstanding is to treat this as mere oversight. Marxist feminists later extended his analysis to reveal how essential this unpaid labor is to accumulation. By externalizing its cost to the household, capital reduces wage expenses. The system benefits from labor it does not compensate. Second, gender division of labor stabilizes hierarchy. Historically, women have been assigned primary responsibility for domestic work. This division appears cultural or biological, yet it aligns economically. When one gender performs unpaid reproductive labor, the other becomes more available for wage labor. The arrangement supports accumulation while reinforcing dependence. The misunderstanding is to see family roles as purely personal choice, detached from economic structure. Structure shapes choice. Third, the family transmits ideology. Children learn obedience, authority, gender expectations, and attitudes toward work within household. Respect for hierarchy, acceptance of routine, internalization of discipline. These lessons prepare individuals for broader social order. The family thus becomes microcosm of society. It normalizes power relations long before individuals enter workplace. In a world approaching 2025, family structures diversify. Single parents, dual income households, remote work blurring home and office. Yet reproductive labor persists. It may shift forms, but someone must perform it. Often, women continue to shoulder disproportionate burden even while participating in wage labor. This double load intensifies stress. The psychological dimension is profound. When unpaid labor is undervalued, those who perform it may internalize diminished worth. Care work becomes expected duty rather than recognized contribution. Emotional exhaustion accumulates quietly. The market counts profits. It does not count comfort given at midnight or hours spent nurturing children. Capitalism benefits from this invisibility. By framing domestic labor as love rather than work, it avoids compensation. Love becomes justification for economic arrangement. Yet love does not negate labor. The two coexist. Marx's analysis invites uncomfortable clarity. Who benefits when essential labor remains unpaid? The family also mediates class reproduction. Wealthy households transfer capital, networks, and cultural knowledge to children. Working-class families transfer resilience, but often lack economic leverage. Thus, inequality persists across generations. Property remains concentrated. Opportunity stratifies. In approaching 2025, rising housing costs, childcare expenses, and healthcare burdens intensify family pressure. Individuals delay forming families due to economic insecurity. Reproductive decisions become tied to financial stability. Intimate life becomes subordinate to market logic. Marx's critique does not dismiss emotional bonds. He does not deny affection or loyalty within families. He questions how economic structure shapes them. When financial stress dominates, relationships strain. When unpaid labor accumulates disproportionately, resentment builds. Structural inequality seeps into intimacy. The liberation of women thus becomes inseparable from economic transformation. If women achieve formal equality in law, but remain burdened by unpaid labor, inequality persists. True emancipation requires redistribution of reproductive responsibilities and recognition of their economic significance. Care work reveals contradiction at heart of capitalism. The system depends on nurturing human beings capable of labor, yet it undervalues the very processes that sustain them. Productivity metrics overlook emotional development. Profit calculations ignore domestic maintenance. The existential impact extends beyond gender. Men socialized to equate identity with wage labor may experience crisis when employment falters. If worth is tied to breadwinning, unemployment wounds deeply. Family roles, shaped by economic expectations, constrain personal growth. Marx's structural lens shows that private life is not insulated from political economy. The household is woven into the fabric of production. It absorbs costs, reproduces labor power, and stabilizes hierarchy. As global capitalism expands, family forms intersect with international labor markets. Migrant workers leave families behind to provide care in wealthier countries. Care chains stretch across continents. One woman's paid domestic labor in affluent household may rely on another woman's unpaid labor in poorer region, caring for her children. The system globalizes reproduction. This expansion exposes broader dynamics of imperialism and globalization. Capital does not remain within national borders. It seeks profit across the globe. Labor migrates. Resources flow outward. Inequality widens between nations. Just as families reproduce labor within households, entire regions may become sites of extraction, sustaining wealth elsewhere. To grasp the full scope of exploitation, analysis must extend beyond domestic sphere to international arena. The same logic that organizes factory and family scales outward. Capital searches relentlessly for cheaper labor, weaker regulations, new markets. National borders do not restrain it. They become tools within its strategy. Understanding this global movement reveals that class struggle transcends any single country. It binds workers across continents in shared condition, even when divided by language, culture, or flag. Capital does not respect borders. It expands or it dies. Marx understood that capitalism is not a local arrangement, but a global force. Once surplus becomes imperative, once accumulation defines survival of capital, expansion becomes necessity. When profits narrow in one region, capital seeks new territories, new labor pools, new markets, new resources. This movement is not accidental. It is structural. After examining the family as hidden site of reproduction, the lens widens. Just as households absorb costs to sustain labor power, entire nations can be drawn into unequal exchange to sustain global accumulation. Imperialism is not merely political domination. It is economic strategy. It is the extension of capital into territories where labor is cheaper, regulation weaker, resistance fragmented. First, capital exports itself in search of higher returns. When wages rise in industrial centers, production shifts to regions where labor can be purchased at lower cost. Factories relocate. Supply chains stretch. The goods consumed in wealthy countries are often produced by workers in poorer ones under harsher conditions. The misunderstanding is to view globalization as neutral integration. Integration occurs, but not on equal terms. Power determines direction. Second, inequality between nations becomes structural. Wealthy countries often control technology, finance, and intellectual property. Poorer countries supply raw materials and labor. Trade agreements may appear mutually beneficial, yet bargaining power differs drastically. Debt binds developing economies to financial institutions. Infrastructure projects may entrench dependency. The global system mirrors class division within nations. Third, nationalism can obscure shared class interests. Workers in one country may blame foreign labor for job losses. They may demand protectionism. Meanwhile, capital moves fluidly across borders. The real conflict between labor and capital becomes reframed as conflict between nations. This fragmentation benefits those at top. Marx foresaw need for international solidarity because exploitation transcends nationality. In a world approaching 2025, globalization intensifies. Digital platforms coordinate labor across continents. Remote work allows companies to hire globally. Manufacturing hubs shift rapidly. Yet migration restrictions limit mobility of workers more than capital. Borders constrain people more than money. This asymmetry reveals hierarchy. The psychological effect is division. Workers in wealthy nations may fear competition from abroad. Workers in poorer nations may accept lower wages for survival. Instead of recognizing common position within global structure, they perceive each other as threats. Ideology fuels this perception. Media narratives frame economic anxiety in nationalist terms. Imperialism also operates through cultural influence. Media exports shape aspirations worldwide. Consumer desires spread. Local economies reorient toward global markets. Traditional production systems dissolve under pressure of multinational corporations. Cultural homogenization accompanies economic integration. Marx's analysis challenges simplistic narratives of development. Growth in one region may rely on extraction from another. Environmental degradation in poorer nations often supplies consumption in richer ones. The costs of accumulation distribute unevenly. The existential dimension surfaces in migration. Individuals leave homes seeking opportunity abroad. They send remittances back. Families stretch across continents. Labor becomes global commodity. Identity fragments between origin and destination. The system depends on this mobility, yet rarely guarantees security. International solidarity appears difficult in such landscape. Language barriers, cultural differences, political repression. Yet underlying conditions converge. Precarious contracts, wage stagnation, intensified productivity, surveillance technologies. The form varies. The logic persists. Marx insisted that workers have no country in ultimate sense. Their structural position binds them beyond borders. This statement is provocative. It challenges emotional attachment to nation, yet it highlights economic reality. Capital treats territory instrumentally. It relocates when profitable. Workers remain rooted. This asymmetry creates vulnerability. In approaching 2025, supply chain crises expose interconnectedness. A disruption in one region ripples globally. Dependence becomes visible. Yet solutions often prioritize stabilization of capital rather than protection of labor. The global division of labor also intersects with environmental crisis. Extraction industries operate in vulnerable regions. Climate change disproportionately affects those least responsible for emissions. Economic inequality compounds ecological vulnerability. Imperial logic extends into environmental domain. Marx's framework does not predict uniform revolution. It identifies tension. As capital expands, it integrates more workers into global system. Awareness can spread alongside exploitation. Communication technologies connect struggles across continents. Labor movements coordinate transnationally. Yet repression and co-optation persist. The family, the school, the factory, the nation, all interlock within global structure. Reproduction of labor, formation of consciousness, extraction of surplus, expansion across borders. Each layer reinforces others. The promise of globalization often emphasizes opportunity, and indeed, many escape extreme poverty through industrial growth. Yet Marx asks at what cost and for whom? Does integration grant genuine autonomy or deepen dependence? Does growth empower communities or entrench corporate dominance? The deeper question intensifies. If capitalism generates not only material inequality, but spiritual crisis, if alienation spreads alongside abundance, what becomes of meaning? Material success does not automatically satisfy human need for purpose. Consumption may increase, yet emptiness may persist. As commodities multiply and global markets expand, individuals may find themselves more connected economically, yet more fragmented internally. To grasp full consequence of this system, one must examine not only exploitation and expansion, but the crisis of meaning it produces. When life revolves around production and consumption, when success is measured in accumulation, what happens to creativity, solidarity, and depth? Beneath economic inequality lies another fracture, a quiet erosion of purpose that no increase in goods can fully repair. Material abundance does not guarantee meaning. It often conceals its absence. Marx's critique of capitalism is not limited to wages, surplus, or class domination. Beneath the economic machinery lies a spiritual vacuum. When production and consumption become the central axis of life, human beings risk shrinking into functions: producer, consumer, competitor. The question is no longer only who owns the means of production. It is what kind of human being the system produces. After tracing the expansion of capital across the globe, after witnessing how it reorganizes nations and families, we arrive at a quieter crisis. Individuals in affluent societies may possess unprecedented access to goods. Technology reduces hardship, comfort increases. Yet anxiety, depression, and alienation persist. This contradiction is not accidental. It reveals structural emptiness. First, capitalism encourages consumption as substitute for creation. The worker alienated in production seeks fulfillment in consumption. Buy more, upgrade, replace. The market promises identity through acquisition. Yet consumption is passive. It does not require transformation of the self. It offers stimulation without depth. The misunderstanding is to think dissatisfaction stems from insufficient consumption. The system responds to emptiness by offering more commodities. But quantity does not resolve absence of meaning. Second, success becomes defined materially. Wealth, status, visibility. These metrics dominate imagination. Education channels students toward lucrative careers. Media glorifies accumulation. Failure becomes economic inadequacy. When value is measured primarily by income or possessions, other dimensions of life recede. Creativity without profit appears trivial. Care without wage appears secondary. Human worth becomes tied to productivity. Third, convenience replaces growth. Technological systems streamline tasks. Algorithms anticipate preferences. Friction diminishes. Yet struggle often cultivates depth. When life becomes optimized for ease, resilience may erode. The system rewards efficiency, not reflection. Speed, not contemplation. Individuals move quickly, yet think shallowly. Comfort becomes an aesthetic. In a world approaching 2025, digital culture intensifies this dynamic. Social media platforms commodify attention. Personal experience becomes content. Identity is curated for display. The line between authentic expression and marketable persona blurs. Individuals perform themselves for algorithmic approval. Recognition is quantified, meaning risks being outsourced to metrics. The psychological result is fragmentation. One may appear successful, yet feel hollow. One may consume constantly, yet feel restless. The market provides endless options, but no ultimate purpose. Choice multiplies, direction dissolves. Freedom without orientation becomes paralysis. Marx did not romanticize pre-industrial hardship. He did not suggest poverty carries inherent nobility. His critique targets structural reduction of human life to economic function. When the highest aim becomes profit maximization, other values subordinate themselves. Art becomes industry. Relationships become networking. Leisure becomes preparation for work. The crisis of meaning is not individual weakness. It is structural consequence. When labor is alienated and commodities dominate, individuals seek significance elsewhere. Some turn to nationalism, others to identity politics, others to escapist entertainment. These responses vary, but the underlying hunger remains. Material success does not automatically heal alienation. A high salary may alleviate financial stress, but not restore creative control. A luxurious home may provide comfort, but not community. The system equates improvement in standard of living with improvement in life itself. Marx challenges this equivalence. The existential question deepens. What does it mean to live well? Is it accumulation? Is it consumption? Or is it active participation in shaping one's world collectively? Under capitalism, participation is mediated by market power. Those with capital influence decisions disproportionately. Others adapt. In approaching 2025, corporate culture increasingly markets purpose alongside products. Companies speak of mission and values. They sponsor social causes. Yet profit remains guiding imperative. Purpose becomes branding strategy. This commodification of meaning reveals how deeply crisis runs. The family, school, workplace, and global market converge in shaping subjectivity. Individuals internalize pressure to perform, to optimize, to compete. Rest becomes guilt-ridden. Slowness becomes inefficiency. Reflection becomes luxury. The system rarely pauses to ask whether constant acceleration enhances life. Marx's analysis suggests that crisis of meaning cannot be solved by individual self-help alone. Structural transformation is required. When production is organized for profit rather than need, when labor remains alienated, emptiness persists. Yet the void also creates possibility. Dissatisfaction can awaken critique. When individuals recognize that material comfort does not satisfy deeper needs, they may question structure. They may seek cooperative forms of work. They may pursue collective projects that prioritize use value over exchange value. The crisis of meaning intersects with class struggle. Workers, burdened by precarious labor, may feel both economic and existential insecurity. Middle classes, trapped in competitive rat race, may experience quiet despair. Even capital owners may feel isolation within competitive logic. The system encourages individuals to interpret emptiness as personal failure, not productive enough, not successful enough. The response becomes more work, more consumption. The cycle tightens. Marx invites different interpretation. The problem is not insufficient effort, it is structural orientation. When human beings are reduced to instruments of accumulation, their need for creative, communal life remains unmet. This spiritual crisis connects directly to ideology. If individuals believe the system is natural, inevitable, the only possible arrangement, they adapt to emptiness. They rationalize it, they normalize it. To challenge crisis of meaning requires unveiling the beliefs that sustain it. Power does not maintain itself solely through force. It operates through culture, narratives, assumptions about freedom and success. People may feel free while operating within boundaries set by economic structure. They may believe their desires are self-generated when shaped by advertising and social expectation. Understanding this mechanism of control is essential. If alienation, commodity fetishism, surplus extraction, class struggle, global expansion, and crisis of meaning all interlock, ideology functions as glue. It convinces individuals that what is constructed is natural, that what is contingent is permanent. To grasp full scope of capitalism's hold, one must examine how control operates not only through ownership of production, but through ownership of ideas, through shaping of consciousness itself. Oppression does not survive by chains alone. It survives by belief. Marx understood that power is most stable when it appears natural, when workers accept their position as inevitable, when inequality feels like outcome of merit, when the market is perceived not as historical structure, but as eternal law. Control does not require constant violence. It requires ideology. After confronting the crisis of meaning, after seeing how consumption masks emptiness, the question sharpens. Why do individuals continue to defend a system that alienates them? Why does exploitation persist without permanent revolt? The answer lies not only in economic dependency, but in consciousness shaped by dominant ideas. First, ideology transforms historical arrangements into common sense. Capitalism presents itself as natural evolution of human exchange. Competition is framed as human instinct. Private property appears sacred. Wage labor seems ordinary. When something is perceived as natural, it escapes critique. The misunderstanding is to think ideology is deliberate propaganda alone. It is deeper. It is embedded in language, education, media, family narratives. It shapes what feels realistic. Second, freedom under capitalism is defined narrowly. Individuals are free to buy, sell, choose employment, express opinion. These liberties are real, yet they coexist with economic constraint. A worker may choose among employers, but cannot choose not to work without facing deprivation. Formal freedom masks material necessity. The system proclaims liberty while structuring dependence. The misunderstanding is to equate choice within framework with control over framework itself. Third, power reproduces itself culturally. Media owned by concentrated capital influences perception of success, failure, and justice. Corporate advertising shapes desire. Political discourse often avoids questioning ownership of production. Even dissent may be commodified. Radical slogans become fashion statements. Critique becomes content. The system absorbs opposition and sells it back. In a world approaching 2025, digital platforms amplify ideological control subtly. Algorithms curate information according to engagement metrics. Outrage circulates rapidly. Attention fragments. Complex structural critique competes poorly with sensational headlines. Individuals feel informed, yet remain disoriented. Control operates not through censorship alone, but through saturation. The psychological mechanism is internalization. Workers blame themselves for unemployment. Students blame themselves for debt. Families blame themselves for instability. Structural forces fade behind personal narrative. Ideology individualizes systemic outcomes. When responsibility is internalized, collective action weakens. Marx argued that ruling ideas are ideas of ruling class. Those who control material production often influence intellectual production. Universities depend on funding. Media depends on advertising. Cultural institutions rely on sponsorship. Direct control is not always necessary. Economic dependency shapes boundaries of acceptable discourse. The concept of false consciousness emerges here. It does not mean people are stupid. It means perception is filtered through dominant framework. Workers may identify more strongly with national identity or consumer aspiration than with class position. They may aspire to join elite rather than challenge structure. Hope of upward mobility stabilizes hierarchy. Ideology also redefines success. Wealth accumulation becomes proof of virtue. Poverty becomes evidence of laziness. Structural inequality becomes invisible. Meritocracy narrative comforts winners and disciplines losers. It persuades individuals that system rewards talent fairly. The existential cost is quiet despair. Individuals chase goals defined by market. When achieved, satisfaction remains partial. When unachieved, guilt intensifies. Either way, system escapes scrutiny. Control functions because it aligns external compulsion with internal desire. In approaching 2025, surveillance capitalism deepens control. Data collection monitors behavior. Predictive algorithms anticipate consumption patterns. Influence becomes targeted. Political messaging tailored. Individuals believe they act freely while nudged subtly. The boundary between persuasion and manipulation blurs. Marx's insight extends here. When economic structure shapes cultural superstructure, liberation requires more than policy change. It requires transformation of consciousness. Workers must recognize that their situation is not natural fate, but historical construction. Yet ideology is resilient. It adapts. It incorporates critique. Corporate social responsibility programs, diversity campaigns, green branding. These initiatives may contain genuine improvement, yet they can also diffuse structural challenge by offering symbolic concessions. True freedom, in Marx's view, demands collective control over economy. If production is organized democratically, if surplus distribution is decided collectively, then ideology loses some of its force. Individuals no longer relate to system as external power, but as participatory structure. The path is not simple. Attempts to reorganize economy historically have encountered repression, mismanagement, authoritarianism. Marx did not provide detailed blueprint. He articulated direction. Liberation requires dismantling conditions that render exploitation normal. The deeper psychological shift involves reclaiming agency, to see oneself not as isolated competitor, but as participant in collective process, to question narratives that justify inequality, to connect personal struggle with structural analysis. Control thrives on fragmentation. Liberation requires solidarity. When workers in different sectors, nations, genders recognize shared position, ideology weakens. Nationalism, racism, sexism often function to divide laboring classes. They redirect anger away from ownership structure. In approaching 2025, global crises such as climate change and economic instability reveal limits of individual solutions. Collective action becomes necessity. Yet ideology continues to frame solutions within market logic. Green consumerism replaces systemic transformation. Corporate pledges substitute for democratic restructuring. Marx's framework insists that true freedom cannot exist while economic life remains controlled by minority for profits. Formal rights without material autonomy produce partial emancipation. Control of production determines scope of freedom. The crisis of meaning, alienation, global inequality, ideological distortion all converge toward a final question. If capitalism shapes subjectivity and restricts collective agency, what alternative vision exists? Not merely absence of exploitation, but presence of human flourishing. What would society look like if production were organized for need rather than profit? If labor became voluntary expression rather than compulsion? If cooperation replaced competition as central organizing principle? The answer requires imagining a different form of life altogether. Not utopian fantasy detached from material reality, but a concrete possibility rooted in reorganization of economic foundation itself. Human liberation is not charity, it is structural transformation. Marx does not end his critique with despair. He does not expose alienation, exploitation, ideology, and global domination merely to condemn. He aims beyond diagnosis. He points toward a different organization of life, not perfection, not paradise, but a society in which human beings cease to function as instruments of profit and begin to exist as conscious creators of their collective world. After tracing how labor becomes alienated, how commodities conceal relations, how surplus is extracted, how class conflict shapes history, how education and family reproduce hierarchy, how capital expands globally, how meaning erodes, and how ideology stabilizes control, one conclusion emerges. As long as production is organized for profit, human development remains secondary. Liberation demands reordering this priority. First, production must be organized for need rather than accumulation. Under capitalism, goods are produced when profitable, not necessarily when socially necessary. Food may be wasted while hunger persists because distribution does not yield sufficient return. Housing may remain empty while homelessness grows. The misunderstanding is to imagine that markets automatically align supply with need. They align supply with purchasing power. Liberation requires collective decision-making about what society produces and why. Second, labor must transform from compulsion into voluntary creative activity. Marx envisions a society where individuals contribute according to ability and receive according to need. This does not eliminate effort, it reorients it. Work ceases to be mere survival strategy. It becomes expression of capacity. The distinction is radical. When individuals participate in shaping production democratically, labor regains meaning. Alienation diminishes because activity reflects shared purpose. Third, cooperation replaces competition as organizing principle. Competition may stimulate innovation, but it also fragments solidarity. It isolates individuals. It breeds anxiety. In a cooperative framework, productivity can still increase, yet without constant fear of displacement. The energy now spent on rivalry can redirect toward collective problem solving. In a world approaching 2025, imagining such transformation feels daunting. Capital is global, technology complex, institutions entrenched. Yet cracks appear. Cooperative enterprises emerge. Worker-owned firms experiment with democratic governance. Community-supported agriculture challenges industrial food chains. These initiatives remain limited, yet they demonstrate possibility. Marx did not provide detailed administrative blueprint. He offered direction grounded in material analysis. If ownership of means of production defines power, then democratizing ownership alters structure fundamentally. This democratization need not be simplistic state control alone. It can take varied forms: public ownership, cooperative models, hybrid systems prioritizing social welfare over profit maximization. Human liberation also implies full development of capacities. Under capitalism, individuals often specialize narrowly. They become efficient in limited tasks. Marx imagined a society where individuals could develop multiple talents, work part of day, engage in artistic or intellectual pursuits in another, not as luxury of elite, but as norm. This vision challenges assumption that economic efficiency requires rigid specialization. Education in such society would cultivate critical thought rather than obedience. It would nurture creativity without immediate pressure of market value. Care work would be recognized as essential labor, distributed equitably, supported collectively. Gender hierarchies tied to economic dependency would erode. International solidarity would replace imperial extraction. Resources shared cooperatively. Trade based on mutual benefit rather than dominance. Such transformation requires more than moral appeal. It requires structural change in property relations and political power. Critics argue that attempts at socialist reorganization have historically produced authoritarian regimes. This warning must be taken seriously. Concentration of power in state can replicate hierarchy. Marx's core insight remains separate from distortions. Human liberation cannot mean replacing private domination with bureaucratic domination. It must involve genuine democratic participation. The existential dimension is decisive. Liberation is not only economic redistribution, it is restoration of subjectivity. When individuals recognize themselves as co-authors of social order, not passive recipients, dignity expands. Responsibility deepens. Freedom becomes substantive rather than formal. In approaching 2025, technological advancement offers paradox. Automation can reduce necessary labor time. If organized for profit, this produces unemployment and insecurity. If organized for need, it can increase leisure and creative opportunity. Technology itself is neutral. Structure determines its impact. Marx's vision challenges fatalism. Capitalism is not eternal law. It emerged historically. It can transform historically. The same human creativity that built global markets can design alternative systems. The obstacle is not lack of capacity. It is concentration of power and internalization of ideology. Human liberation also redefines wealth. Wealth becomes not accumulation of commodities, but expansion of human potential. Access to education, healthcare, cultural participation, community, time for reflection, time for relationship, time for creativity. These become measures of prosperity. The family would transform under such conditions. Care labor socialized and supported. Gender equality grounded economically. Children raised not primarily to compete, but to collaborate. Workplaces governed democratically. Schools oriented toward critical inquiry. Global relations structured by cooperation. Skepticism remains. Change of this magnitude encounters resistance from those benefiting from status quo. Transition requires collective organization. Consciousness must shift alongside material conditions. Reform and revolution debated, strategy contested. Yet the alternative is continuation of alienation and crisis. Marx's philosophy ends not with comfort, but with invitation. If human beings created capitalism, they can create something beyond it. The question is whether they will recognize their collective power. As crises multiply, climate instability, economic volatility, social fragmentation, the urgency intensifies. Individual solutions prove insufficient. Structural transformation becomes less utopian and more practical necessity. Liberation demands courage to question what appears natural, to imagine beyond inherited frameworks, to risk collective experimentation. It demands recognition that dignity cannot be fully realized within structures that commodify life itself. And so the inquiry does not close. It turns outward. It asks each generation whether it will accept being a cog in machinery of accumulation or insist on becoming conscious participant in shaping shared destiny. The possibility remains open, waiting not in abstract theory, but in material conditions already shifting beneath the surface. Marx does not simply explain how society functions. He exposes why it feels suffocating. He forces us to confront a brutal question. Are we living as creators of our world, or merely as components within a system we did not choose? From alienation in labor to the fetishism of commodities, from surplus extraction to class conflict, from ideological control to global expansion, Marx maps a structure that penetrates not only factories and markets, but consciousness itself. He shows that exploitation does not always look violent. It looks normal. It is signed in contracts. It is taught in schools. It is reproduced in families. It is celebrated as opportunity. His philosophy is not nostalgia for a simpler past. It is not blind rage against wealth. It is a demand for clarity. If labor creates value, who owns it? If production shapes life, who controls it? If freedom exists only within economic necessity, is it truly freedom? Marx insists that emancipation cannot be cosmetic. Changing leaders without changing ownership changes little. Reforming laws without transforming economic structure leaves hierarchy intact. Liberation requires rethinking how we organize work, how we distribute resources, how we define success, how we measure human worth. In a world of growing inequality, spiritual fatigue, and endless consumption, his critique remains unsettling. Material progress has not erased alienation. Abundance has not guaranteed meaning. Choice has not ensured autonomy. The question persists: can human beings live as conscious subjects, shaping their collective destiny, or will they remain cogs in a machine that treats life as fuel for accumulation? Marx does not hand us a finished blueprint. He hands us responsibility to examine the structures we inhabit, to question what appears natural, to imagine economic relations that serve human development rather than subordinate it. The challenge he leaves is uncompromising. Freedom is not merely the right to choose within the market. It is the power to decide, together, how the market itself should exist. And that question still stands before us, demanding an answer.